Hey guys, do you know someone considering renting their property as an Airbnb? I have worked with Rental Advisor for over a decade, and Rental Advisor provides free rental projections to prospective owners, realtors, and investors for any property in the US. So if you know someone considering getting into the vacation rental industry, have them email management@myrentaladvisor.com to get their free revenue projections. So in understanding the critical social justice movement, the authors of Cynical Theories, James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, they show that there are some recurring themes that the activists are pulling from the neo-Marxist and postmodernist tradition. So the first is sort of this idea of society as groups and power. This is a very neo-Marxist idea. The idea here is that society is fundamentally comprised of different groups with different levels of power, and social systems exist between these groups that result in very different outcomes due to the interplay of the power dynamics within the system. And the system favors some groups over others. From that also comes the idea of intersectionality. This is another principle. This is the notion that a person can exist at the intersections of multiple oppressed or privileged groups. For example, a black lesbian woman is a part of 3 marginalized groups, whereas a white straight male is a part of 3 privileged groups. The next is the notion of social constructions, and this is a very kind of postmodernist idea. And this is the idea that power dynamics of a society are not inherent. They're socially constructed by those who are in power, and thus can be changed and should be changed in order to grant greater equity in society. Another postmodern manifestation within the social justice movements of today is the idea of language as power. So this is the idea that language is a social construct, and it can be employed to control discourse and thought to the advantage of those in power. So altering language helps alter discourses and social power structures. That's why, as you deal with woke people, you'll notice that they use a lot of either new terms or existing terms in new ways. The next principle is actually kind of a combination of Marxian thought and Freudian thought, and it's sort of this idea of liberation. Freud, for instance, had an idea of repression and that people were repressed, and the neo-Marxists kind of latched onto that, and this idea of liberation is that with the lack of oppressive power structures and dynamics kind of holding a person back, a person, can then be liberated or free to be their authentic self. So the next two are kind of interesting because they kind of conflict with each other. But the first one is identity. And this is the idea that human beings are free to construct their own identity, free from the constraints of any externally imposed categories. The next, which comes into conflict with it, is an idea of what's called positionality. This is the idea that humans are products of their socialization and thus are incapable of knowing things outside of their group identity. This is sort of the idea that, I'm a white male. Therefore, I just need to shut up and listen to the experiences of people of color. My position, because of the group that I'm in, does not allow me to understand the lived experiences of people that are not part of my group. Another postmodern principle is just general skepticism. It's this idea, that all-encompassing narratives like religion, nationalism, etc., these are all just tools for those in power. Another aspect of this movement is sort of this Marxist moral realignment. In traditional Marxism, the morality really centered around this idea of economic equity, that there was equity in the distribution of economic goods. In the neo-Marxist movement and the critical social justice movement, the moral realignment centers around the equitable distribution of power in society. And lastly, but certainly not least, is the idea of praxis and activism. Praxis is the idea of putting ideas into practice, right, through activism. Critical social justice is not about theory. It's fundamentally about putting that theory into action so that we can actually create equity. So in summary, critical theory is this notion that society is best viewed as an interplay between different power groups, between the oppressed and their oppressors. A world in which the language we use, the institutions we create, the laws we enact, even our personal preferences are social constructions by the groups who hold power over language, institutions, and all aspects of our socialization. To adopt critical consciousness, the academic word for being woke, is to awaken to this reality. And then, under the principle of praxis, we are called to do something about it. Social justice activists are called to do this through direct social and institutional changes and by helping others to adopt critical consciousness, thus creating new activists, especially students. The authors, James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, named their book Cynical Theories because of the way this new consciousness causes people to see the world, even, the most mundane human interactions, in the most cynical way possible. They provide a great example. The question is not, did racism take place? For that is to be assumed. But rather, how did racism manifest in that situation? That is, we're to assume that racism is always taking place, and it is our job, as those who are woke, who understand critical consciousness, to examine situations for evidence of it. So essentially what happens is that critical theory then gets applied to all sorts of different things, like race. You get critical race theory, queer theory, gender studies, post-colonial theory, disability and fat studies. There are all sorts of disciplines within the academy that apply this critical lens. In the book, Lindsay and Pluckrose explore these various social disciplines in depth. But I want to take a look at queer theory specifically because I think it really sums up some of these principles very well. So to quote from their book, quote, "Queer theory is about liberation from the normal, especially where it comes to the norms of gender and sexuality. This is because it regards the very existence of the categories of sex, gender, and sexuality to be oppressive. Because queer theory derives directly from postmodernism, it is radically skeptical that these categories are based in any biological reality. Instead, it sees them as quite artificially, wholly as a product of how we talk about these issues. It thus ignores biology nearly completely, or it places it downstream from socialization, and focuses upon them as social constructions perpetuated in language. Queer theory presumes that oppression follows from categorization, which arises every time language constructs a sense of what is normal by producing and maintaining rigid categories of sex, male and female, gender, masculine and feminine, and sexuality, straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and so on, and scripting people into these. Queer theory's ultimate purpose is to identify and make visible the ways in which the linguistic existence of these categories creates oppression, and to disrupt them. In doing so, it exhibits an almost unmodified manifestation of the postmodern themes of the power of language. Language creates the categories, enforces them, and scripts people into them. And the blurring of boundaries. The boundaries are arbitrary, oppressive, and can be erased by blurring them into apparent absurdity. So what's the problem with this worldview? Well, that's the subject we'll cover in our next video. So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it.